Um, I'd love to start with one question, namely, just to the amplifiers. What did you do to get past Deuteronomy and Leviticus? You know, I've started many times. I started with this plan. I'm going to read through the Bible. I'm going to do it this time. And it goes well through Genesis and Exodus. You find some momentum. But then you get to some of those, you know, where you get stuck into Moses' laws and you seem to get stuck a little bit, you know. So you fast forward to 1 Samuel and you kind of go on from there. So I'd be intrigued to know just what your strategy was to go through that. Friends, wonderful. Thank you for the opportunity again to share with you. I really don't take it lightly. And although I'm standing at the back room here in RP, I would have loved to just be with you in person. But I'm grateful for technology, at least at this stage, so we can, you know, just gather at least in some shape and form. If you've spent any time in this study guide so far this week, you would have come across just my fascination with technology. You know, I've just been really, really fascinated and intrigued by the fact that there's been so many technological advances over my lifetime, at least. You know, that it's enriched our lives in so many different ways. And we don't always know about this. We don't always think about this. But recently, I just sat down once as I wrote this the study guide, and I thought to myself, when do I use technology? How often do I use it? You know, and as I start auditing my day, I just realized, man, it's a lot of technology. I'm so dependent. I've grown so dependent upon technology. For example, let me tell you about my first hour and a half of my day. Usually, I get up at about 5:30 in the morning to be at the gym at 6. And when I get to the gym, I start my watch. I've got the watch going, and I start it. It's a timer, but it's also it keeps my heart rate. It tells me what my heart rate is at any given stage, so I can know whether I need to, you know, push a bit harder or whether I can lower a little bit more. It shows me that my calories that I'm burning at this stage. It's also connected via Bluetooth to my phone, which means I can skip songs and I can, you know, adjust the volume from my watch. And then I've got the earpods in my ears also connected via Bluetooth, from which I can also double click on the one side to skip the song. That's also connected to the phone, which I've got running in the background. From the phone, you've got all the music, you know, through Amazon or my sister-in-law's Apple account. I'm not sure if she knows I've got the details for that, but I'm enjoying her music. You know, so it's connected to the phone as well, which has got endless music, everything on the cloud, you know. So I'll be there in the gym listening to my Afrikaans music to get me going in the gym, pump me up a little bit. So all of that is going. And then I've got my gym app on my phone as well, telling me what to do, you know, telling me how many reps I did last time, what the volume was, what type of exercises I need to do today to make sure, through algorithms, to make sure that I improve and I go harder than last time. So all of that. And once I finally get through the 1 hour session, I stop my watch, I save it, and then my watch talks to my phone again and logs everything on my health app to show just the calories that I've burned, my average heart rate, etc. And that's all before 7 a.m. in the morning. And I'm sure you've got some stories yourself as well. You know, in terms of how we use technology, we are so dependent upon it, and it's enriched our lives in so many different ways. So we celebrate that. But you know, if there's one thing, and you'll pick this up, this disgruntled view of one form of technology, you'll pick it up in the study guide as you read it, is I don't like a selfie stick. Like, I can understand a lot of this technology, it makes sense and it enriches our lives, but I'm just not a fan of the selfie stick. Now, I don't want to be a hypocrite. Cam will tell you, on Friday night, we went to a hockey game, and there was one moment where I did take a little selfie with my son next to me at the hockey game to, you know, just to show the family we were there. So I suppose there's a space and a time for old selfie, but for most part, I just don't like them. And I just don't like the selfie stick. You know, I think it reveals something about our culture that it's not too good. It's not too biblical. And I want to be careful again this morning. You know, I don't want to be like the old cynic philosophers of the day. The cynics, even back in Jesus' day, was referred to. The word cynic, it means the watchdog of society. And they were called the watchdogs because they were always barking at society. They always find fault. And I want to be careful not to be like that. I think there's a lot of good in terms of our culture, in terms of our society. But when it comes to something like the selfie stick, it just shows us that our culture, in so many ways, we are so self-obsessed. In The Guardian, there's an article there as well that says we need to do away with the selfie stick because it is fueling, it's massaging the self-obsession that we have. And so our culture is very self-centered. very self-obsessed. It's about self-confidence and self-fulfillment, and in a way we get unhealthily obsessed with self. And so our passage in 1 Corinthians, and this series that we're looking at the moment, series called Freedom, is a lot about that aspect, that thing of the human heart where it needs to be about us and not about people around us. Everything is about us. It's about our freedoms and our rights. We've become self-obsessed in a way, and so our decision-making in terms of our actions is not based upon God or upon people next to us, but it's all self-centered. And so that's the issues that Paul is addressing now in 1 Corinthians chapter 8 to about 10 and 11. Now, let me recap last week just quickly, just briefly as an introduction, because today's sermon is kind of an add-on or a part B to last week's sermon. And last week's message is really important for us to understand, just so that we understand the rest of the series. Everything will build upon the message that Cam shared with us last week. We saw from his message that in Corinth, the whole situation was like this. There were these ancient temples, these pagan temples. And back in the day, these temples served as a type of restaurant. So people would have their family, they would have their relatives, their friends, and they would go up to the temple, they would take the animal with them. The animal will get slaughtered, will get sacrificed to the local pagan gods. There'll be a whole bunch of rituals and celebrations, and ultimately the family and the friends and everyone will sit around the table, they'll feast upon this animal. So all of the meat at this function would have been dedicated to the local deities, to the local gods. Once celebrations were done, very often there were meat left over. People can only eat so much, and so the leftover meat would be consumed by the priest. The priest would take their portion, but even they could not finish all the meat. And so what happened very often is the leftovers were then sold to the market to recover some of the costs. Some of the monotheists, people like the Jews and the Christians, obviously this posed quite a predicament for them. What do they do with this meat? Because the majority of meat, the great majority of meat had been sacrificed, offered to some sort of pagan god before it eventually ended up in the market. What do? Can they buy it? Can they eat it? And so you had one group of people who thought this through, and they came to the conclusion that God created all things, right? So everything is there for our enjoyment. It needs to be enjoyed to the glory of God, including food and drink. Likewise, idols, these pagan gods and these pagan temples, well, it's nothing other than just wood and stone and metal figures. They're not real, they're not living. There's only one God. So they came to the conclusion, they've got the freedom, they've got the right to enjoy the meat. Paul says this is the strong position. Paul himself also held to that position, by the way. But then you had another group of people perhaps who grew up in those pagan rituals, who grew up in that context, in that society, who went through those rituals growing up. And for them, it was really hard to partake of the meat, to enjoy the meat without associating it with some of the rituals that happened in these pagan temples. These rituals included a bunch of questionable actions, if you want to put it that way, including prostitution and a bunch of other stuff. So when someone like that partook and bought some of the meat and ate it, he would associate the meat with some of that stuff, and it would feel like he was doing something wrong. He was supporting something. It wasn't sitting right with them. Their conscience they had to overstep their conscience to partake of that. And so Paul was addressing the strong position, guys, and saying, listen, you've got to think about your other brothers and sisters. Not everyone it's got the same convictions as you do. And so when you partake of the meat, yes, you've got freedom to do so, but don't do so in front of these guys. Don't cause them to overstep their conscience. Don't cause them to stumble. And that's what the whole discussion is about. It's about these guys using their rights, the right to freedom, in such a way, not based on their knowledge. Yes, they were correct, but based on the way that they love their fellow brothers and sisters. And so now we're going to read on 1 Corinthians chapter 9, where Paul gave the teaching in the previous text that Cam took us through last week. This week, Paul is showing them, listen, this is not a matter of talk for me. This is a way I am living. I am doing this as I'm writing to you. So let's go and read from verse 1 to verse 18. Paul says this, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? And even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and doesn't drink its milk? Do I say this merely on human authority? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. Is it about oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yes, this was written for us, because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in hope of sharing in the harvest. And if we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. But I have not used any of these rights. And I'm not writing this in the hope that you shall do such for me. For I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel, I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. And so very clearly, there's one point in this passage, friends, and that's simply this, that Paul understood he had certain rights, but he did not let his rights dictate his actions. He was never controlled by his rights. Instead, he made it a tool for the glory of God and the good of others. And although he had a right, although he had a knowledge that he had these rights, he wasn't too quick to enforce it. And how that's a word for our culture, for our context, for me as a millennial. You see, towards the latter part of the 20th century, we've made some pretty good progress on the moral and ethical front. And what I mean by that is there's been the acknowledgement that people, all people, are to be valued and are to be respected. In other words, society came together and said it's no longer appropriate for the strong, for those who, for the rich, for the powerful to misuse those who are weaker, for those on the margins. But all people, everyone, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of socioeconomical status, everyone is to be respected as people. Now, this movement started off valiantly, and society kind of gave it the name. They were speaking about human rights, and human rights was all about taking care of the rights of the weak in society, those who are marginalized, those who were bullied in a sense by others that were more powerful or from more privileged backgrounds. And so it started off pretty good, and we've got to celebrate that. But as time went on, these rights, this focus on rights moved from I'm focusing on the rights of those who are marginalized, those who are being bullied, to a focusing on the rights of myself. And very quickly became not about the rights of these people, but my own rights. And very quickly it became something like this. I've got the right to be selfish. I've got the right, to riches. I've got the right to just to be proud. It's all about me, right? The self-centered thing. So the rights moved from the marginalized and those on the margins to myself. And so what a word this is for us, friends. I see even my generation, us as millennials, we are so quick just to claim our rights. We just want to claim our rights. We get through university and we want the top jobs. We don't want to work for them. We've become so entitled. And that has been the result of this human rights movement, which began off as a pretty good thing, valuing people, but now it became very self-centered. It all became about us. And this is what Paul is addressing here in our text this morning. Paul, in a sense, is telling us, he's saying, listen, we've got to grow up. We've got to grow up. We've got to get to a stage where we realize that our rights are not there, to dictate our behavior. They are there for us to use as tools. It's stuff that we have in our hands that we can use to the glory of God and the good of others. And so Paul is very quick here in our text this morning to tell us what rights he has. It's in a sense, friends, like Paul is saying this. He's saying, listen, enough talk. Enough talk. We've spoken about this. I've talked about this. Enough about the talking. Let me show you what I've done. Let me show you the way I live. And so he starts off with a reference of him being an apostle. And interestingly, again, you can just see this heart of his. Listen, enough about the talk, enough about arguing. I know you guys are arguing about which leaders are most influential, which one you like, or which ones you don't, and about my apostleship as Paul. And instead of coming with intellectual arguments, he points to the fact that their very existence is the confirmation of his apostleship. He says, you are the seal of my apostleship. The very fact that you are there, that you've been birthed as a church, points to the fact that God has anointed me as an apostle. He doesn't go to the intellectual stuff, to the arguments. It's like enough is enough. Look at the proof is in the pudding. Look at reality. And the same thing, he goes on, the same thing he does with the rights. We've spoken about this. And now he says this, me as an apostle, don't I have rights? Don't I have the right to food and drink? Don't I have the right to have a believing wife like the other apostles and the Lord's brother and Cephas? He also says, don't I have a right not to work for a living? In other words, don't I have a right to get paid for sharing the gospel, for building up the church, for working for you guys? Don't I have the right to do so? And then he gives 9 different reasons why he has that right. And this is the main emphasis of this text. Basically saying, I've got the right to be paid to do what I'm doing, but I'm not. I'm not enforcing that right. I'm using my right. My rights are not my master. My rights are my tools. So he gives these 9. He says, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and doesn't eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? He then refers to the law of Moses in which it states, do not muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. Whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in hope of sharing the harvest. He says they have sown spiritual seed among them, and therefore is it too much to ask for a material harvest from them? He says, don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar get to share what is offered at the altar? He even goes as far as referencing Jesus and says, in the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. You see what he's doing? He's telling them, listen, I understand my rights. I understand my freedoms. I know what has come to me, what's almost mine by right. But I will not be dictated by that. I will not be controlled by that. Rather, in verse 15, it says, but I haven't used any of these rights. Paul was a tent maker. He refused to take money from the church. He refused to take money because he was going to be an example of what it looked like to lay down one's rights. He did this on purpose. Not to say that those who are paid by the church, like me, are wrong. I don't think that's what it's saying. This is Paul saying, I know I've got that right, but I won't take it up. And the reason I'm going to take it up is not because I enjoy being poor or because I enjoy making tents. This was the greatest theologian the church has ever had. He wrote the book of Romans. He wrote the most of the New Testament. It's not him saying, I'm not really interested in this gospel stuff. It was all of his life. It's not like he preferred tent making above this, but he used it as an example to show the churches to lay down your rights for each other, for the glory of God and the good of others. This is what Paul is all about. There's one, you'll pick this up on Tuesday in your study, guys. I don't want to spoil the whole story, but there's one article that the BBC have done on the President of Uruguay. Now, he's called the poorest president in the world. I don't know if he still is president, but he used to be at least. The guy's name is, and Luis, you can correct me afterwards, Jose Mujica. That's the guy's name. Now, what he's done, this Jose, is he became president of Uruguay, but instead of moving into the parliamentary house, into this, this wonderful estate that the Uruguayan government had prepared for him with all the guards and the security and all the luxuries, he refused it. He said, obviously, this is his right as the president of Uruguay to live in such a way, but he refused it. He said, no, thank you. I'd rather live on my farm. I'd work my ground. I will take water from the earth. And so instead of having all of the luxuries and all of the riches, he preferred just to stay on the farm with his wife. And instead of having all the security and all the guards, he's got 2 security guards and a 3-legged dog called Manuela to take care of him. On top of that, he donates 90% of his salary to charity every month. This is perhaps a modern day example of what Paul is referring to. He's got the right to go live in this, this mansion, if you want to call it that way, be taken care of, have all the luxuries. He's an apostle. And yet he lays it all down. He uses it as a tool to strengthen the church. And so, friends, let's get to our application this morning. What does it mean for us? How do we view our rights? How do we view our freedoms? How do we view the things that belong to us? And to make it very practical and put a name on it, they speak about our time, our talents, our treasure, terror, and our temple. How do we view those things? I mean, these are the things that God has given to us, right? In other words, they belong to us. God has given time to me. He's given me, certain talents. He's given me certain treasures and possessions. He's given me this earth to enjoy. He's given me my body. And so the question becomes, what am I doing with that? What am I doing with that? Do I make them my master, or are they my tools? Right? Will I be mastered by the sense of, I'm entitled. Time belongs to me. My body belongs to me. My talents belong to me. Therefore, I can use them as I want to. And I ought to use them as I want to for myself. Will that be my approach? Or will I imitate Paul and say, you know what, my time has been given to me by God, and therefore I will use it in such a way to honor God and to serve people. My talents, my treasure, my body, this earth which we had received, will I use it as a tool for the good of people and for the glory of God? Paul, this Jose Mujica is he follows the example of Paul in a way. I don't know if the man's a Christian or not, but it seems like, in some sense, at least in the material sense, that's what he's doing. But Paul is following the example of another, the Lord Jesus Christ. And how fitting this morning, as we speak about the season of Epiphany, looking at the example of Jesus. Jesus is the ultimate example of one who laid down his rights to the glory of God and the good of others. I've shared this with you before, and I want to share it with you again. But before I do so, just listen to this beautiful verse. We've read it this morning, we've sung it this morning. Philippians chapter 2, speaking about Jesus, it says, who in very being is of the nature of God, did not consider equality with God a thing to be used to his own advantage, but rather he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, and being made in human likeness, and being found in the appearance of man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. Who by very nature is God, and yet he lays it all down, not for his own advantage, he says, but he humbled himself. He humbled himself. He laid it all down. And so when we do that comparison, as I've shared with you in a sermon before, I thought it's so appropriate to bring it up again. Look at the life of Jesus. As we look at these 5 different categories that kind of sum up where our rights would fall into, not limited to, but at least a good chunk of it, our time. The person who is mastered by their rights, that's mastered by their freedom, would look at their time and go, my time belongs to me. I will spend it however I want, on whatever I want, wherever I want. And yet Jesus comes and models a different way. He says his time will be his tool. And so Jesus gave his time to proclaim the good news to the poor, to proclaim freedom to the captives, to open the eyes of the blind, and to set the oppressed free. One thinks about treasure. The one who is mastered by his treasure, his right to riches, right? He will say, my treasure belongs to me. My money and my possessions, it's mine, and I will do with it whatever I want. It's my ticket to the good life. And yet you think about Jesus, who gave up the riches and the splendors of heaven to be born into a poor carpenter's house so that he could come and save us. And so even when they wanted to make him king, he refused that they do so. One thinks about talents, the giftings that the Lord has given to us, the one who is driven and mastered by by their rights, will say that my gifts, my talents belongs to me. I can use them however I want. I will draw focus upon myself. I will use these giftings in a way that gets something from people instead of giving to people. Things like money, things like pleasure, things like possessions. But when one look at Jesus, our King of Kings, and you just look at him, you see he used his gift, his talents to feed the multitudes, to heal the blind, the deaf, the mute, and the lame, and to put the body of a little girl who was dead before alive back into the arms of her mother. One thinks about terror, the earth. Those who are mastered by this entitled sense of living, that this belongs to us. They'll say the earth belongs to me. It exists to fulfill my desires. And yet one looks at the New Testament and you see what Jesus, it says that by him, in him, all things were created. Things in heaven, things on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers, rulers or authorities, all things were made through him and for him. And yet the Lord Jesus Christ shares all of this with us. And lastly, this morning, one thinks about the temple. Those who are mastered by their rights, this is my body. They all say, my body belongs to me. I will choose what I eat, what I drink, and what I do with it. I will choose, my sexuality and my gender nowadays, and whether I will have an abortion or not, and what I'll do with it. And then one looks at Jesus, our ultimate example, not just in the season of Epiphany, but right through. One looks at him and one sees Jesus laying down his body to be beaten and broken, his blood to be spilled, so that the victory of God can be won over evil, and we can partake of his new creation. And so, friends, this morning, in conclusion, I've got one point this morning in my whole sermon. It's the same point we raised last week, but it's just given a practical application. It's given as an example this morning. And the question is this: what will we do with our rights? Will we allow our rights, our freedoms, in terms of our times, talents, treasures, terror, and our temples? Will we use our rights and look at it as being as our masters? In other words, it must be enforced for ourselves, or will we see them as tools, things that we can use for the kingdom and for God and his glory and for the well-being of those around us? And so, Lord, help us to do so in Jesus' name. Amen.